Well, hello, everybody. This is Bill Bittner from IBM, and I'm here to introduce our next session, Preparing Your ZVM Systems for IBM Z Multi-factor Authentication. And with us today, we have Brian Hugenbruch, our ZVM security champion, author and all-around nice guy. So, Brian, will you take it away, please?
Thanks, Bill, and hello to everyone. I'm glad to virtually see everybody here and glad to be a part of the workshop. I always enjoy my opportunity to get a chance to talk to you all whenever I have the opportunity. Would that I could do it in person, but you'll have to take it on my assurance that I've never looked better. I know you can't validate that, but you can trust me, I'm a security guy. So what we'd like to talk today about is MFA. We're going to use that acronym an awful lot. I wouldn't normally bother to introduce myself, but for the benefit of anyone who's watching this recording later on and who may not recognize either the really complicated last name or the voice, my name is Brian Hugenbruch. I have been working in ZVM development in Endicott, New York for just about 20 years now, which means that it is official. I can no longer call myself one of the new kids. About half this time, I've been working as the security nerd-in-chief for ZVM development. So that covers design, development, secure coding, pen testing, vulnerability analysis, threat modeling, security service certification, and compliance for the platform. Does include Linux on Z, does include anything cloud or cloud adjacent. And I'm sorry, I really am sorry, but I'm going to be talking about a security topic today, right after lunch here on the East Coast. This wasn't my idea. I don't know why the VM Workshop Planning Committee put security on after lunch. You can take that up with them, but all I ask is that if you do decide to take a nap during this presentation, please put yourself on mute first. For those asking in the chat, yes, that is the official security hammer. That is actually at the office, not actually at home here with me. While I could try to summon it, it might break a couple windows on the way in, and of course I would have to, I might destroy the washing machine if I threw it in on sterilize, so it's probably best if it stays where it is. So what is it that we are going to talk about? We're going to talk about MFA, multi-factor authentication. What is it? Why do you want it? How do you get it? Where do you place it? How does it interact with ESMs? And then some specifics about how it's going to go. If this sounds a little bit familiar, it's because Yvonne and JR did talk about this a little bit during the Broadcom update yesterday, whereupon they actually did a little bit of a demo. So if you didn't get a chance to see that or want to take another look at it, do go back and look at that playback afterwards, just because it's going to show you some very interesting hands-on details about the things I'm going to chat about. And I should point out that you can't see it, but I have had a fair amount of coffee. If I say anything that doesn't make any sense, or perhaps more to the point, if I say a security thing that makes even less sense than usual, please do post it into the chat. I am keeping an eye on that as we go, and I will try to respond to any questions we have in line, and of course try to present this at a slightly more modulated tone of voice. This is a VM Workshop original presentation. I cannot play the THX sound effect because Bill is recording this session, and I think for copyright purposes, I'm not allowed to use that. But certainly anytime I get to put up that little animated GIF, I kind of hear that in my head because I do love to bring new content here first. What is MFA? This is multi-factor or two-factor authentication, whereupon when you identify yourself to a system, you are going to prove that you are who you say you are by a means other than or in addition to a traditional password or a password phrase. And this will be made up of something that you have, such as a mobile device or a digital certificate, something that you know, such as a password, password phrase, or similar, and or something that you are, thumbprint, retinal scan, some type of biometric data. MFA is not to be confused with multi-step authentication, whereupon someone asks you for a user ID and a password, and then if both are valid, they will continue to ask you for more credentials. And it's important to make that distinction about what you have, what you are, what you know, because for true multi-factor authentication, we expect you to have two or more of those, multiple categories. The whole point of having MFA or 2FA is to get around the weakness of traditional passwords. And while I appreciate the effort that you might have into having 3 or 4 sticky notes of passwords underneath your keyboard, if someone steals the first sticky note from underneath your keyboard, they're probably not going to stop. They will go ahead and take those other 2, 3, 4 passwords that you may have stored there. But if you also authenticate with a digital certificate or an RSA Secure ID fob, that helps to eliminate that particular weakness with your authentication credentials. Mind you, I don't encourage you to use sticky notes for the storage of any authentication factors. You should, I think we're all past that point by now. But we started looking into this some time ago for the ZVM platform, just because we understand that not having MFA means that it might make security compliance difficult for your ZVM systems. When you're looking at system security for ZVM, you do have to take into account your hypervisor layer. If you don't secure your hypervisor, then your gets and your cloud that you may have running on top of that platform, it's all very well and good if you lock the front door, but if you haven't locked the garage or the windows, there's not a whole, how much good did you really do? So the goal here was to allow a ZVM sysprog or administrator to authenticate to the hypervisor layer without having to rely exclusively on passwords or password phrases. And as we started talking to sponsor users, we realized that this was not going to be a terribly easy thing, because while it pains me to admit it, not everyone in the universe is using RACF. There are other ESMs out there. They're all fine products, but we couldn't make any assumptions about the type of ESM that anyone in this virtual room might be using. Additionally, you all had a bunch of different requirements for the types of auth factors that you wanted to use. And these are often driven by things that are happening elsewhere in your data centers, right? Your security people, bless their hearts, came up with a set of rules for x86 or for other parts of the enterprise, and now we have to figure out how to fit ZVM into that. And then, of course, there are going to be a mix of policy requirements on top of that in terms of whether or not multi-factor versus multi-step was allowed, whether user ID enumeration is okay. Hint, it's not. Whether there was a concern about the replay of tokens or factors. And while we don't often mix the phrase easy to use with security function, that was really our goal. We wanted to make sure that this got in your way, the way of the ZVM system programmer, as little as possible, while still ensuring that you met state-of-the-art modern security. And as much as I would love to be able to hold up my eyeball to my 3270 window, PCOM and Host on Demand do not do native retinal scans. It was going to be a little bit more complicated than just updating the CP logon flow with some anticipation of what all was meant to happen here. So what we have delivered, and this came out just a couple weeks ago, is multi-factor authentication support for ZVM. And you now can, as a system admin or a sysprog, log onto the hypervisor without requiring exclusive use of a password or password phrase. So what happens is you the admin, will present auth factors to the NFA server via a web browser. The particulars of this will be configurable. We'll talk about that. There will be support for logon by and surrogate types of logon for user IDs that may or may not have their own passwords today. And we do support nearly all the out-of-band factors available today for the ZOS version that you may not be familiar with. Now, since I know I've been using some security nerd terms, maybe it's good if I do a quick level set. When I say out-of-band, and you'll see that at the bottom of the screen, it means that you do all the authentication to an external server first, say through a browser connection or through a mobile device, and then that server will give you a derived credential. This token, which is not to be confused with an actual sensitive password, is something that you can plug into a 3270 window. Inbound authentication is a distinct thing, whereupon you would take your user ID and all the authentication factors and provide them right at the time of direct logon, directly into your PCOM window. And we would have, and whether you're doing it out of band or in band, we need to make sure that we prevent user ID enumeration, whereupon you could tell whether or not a username is valid before you've actually authenticated to the system. If we allowed for that kind of a thing, then you would be able to determine whether or not Bill Bittner, for example, is a valid user ID on your VM system. It may or may not be, I don't know, but if I can't authenticate to your system, I shouldn't know either way. Because, either that becomes it allows folks to do brute force attacks once they know that a user ID is valid, or it might allow for spear phishing attempts. If I tried to find Bill's keyboard and find all those sticky notes he has underneath there with all his passwords, I might be able to get into all of the user IDs that he has if I knew precisely what user ID he was claiming to be. So what exactly is working with IBM Z MFA? Quite a lot, actually. This is a slightly expanded chart from what we've been showing for the ZOS IBM Z MFA product. And you'll recognize a lot of the things on here. RSA, secure ID, radius-based factors, touch-based one-time tokens. We've added a LDAP bind as an authentication factor to your system. So you could actually connect to Active Directory via the MFA server and use the password or passphrase that you've set up in Active Directory to log onto your ZVM system, perhaps in conjunction with an RSA secure ID token or a digital certificate. Some of these things you'll see out of band enabled. So that's all this stuff up in the chart here will actually function with ZVM. The in-band only is important to note because that's the stuff that will also work on the ZOS version of the product. The out-of-band only was never going to work with the in-band flow because, again, things like digital certs or retinal scans or thumbprints don't really have quite the same capacity to be entered on a 3270 stream in the way that other things do. The important thing to note is that because this is out of band only for the ZVM version of this support, anything that you have in your ESM today is not going to be valid for an MFA style of logon. There's a reason for this, and don't get rid of those passwords just yet. I'll explain what I mean in just a sec here. So to clarify, we have now out in the field a new product called IBM Z Multi-factor Authentication version 2.1. If you have MFA on ZOS, you'll recognize this because it looks like the exact same product. That said, while you order it like it's the same product, it's actually one of two different server downloads. And the one that you want for your ZVM systems is actually an MFA server that runs as a Linux on Z guest. That guest is something that you will install on your ZVM system, and it'll serve as the policy decision point for ZVM authentication. Again, you'll give all the auth factors to this server rather than to the CP logon screen, and it'll give you a derived token. Now, your ESM still remains the policy enforcement point. Don't mistake this as the ESM has lost all power here, because it's still the ESM that gives you the up or down as to whether or not you're allowed to get into the system. It's just that the repository, what constitutes a valid logon, has shifted slightly in this model. There is ZVM support that is required in order to enable this. This is version 7.1 only. And of course, will be enabled in the base of version 7.2 when that comes out. It is not available for ZVM 6.4. And there will be updates to external security managers. We talked about VM Secure yesterday. There will be similar updates for RACF for VM. We'll talk about each of those. I do see a question in the chat about whether or not this could run in a secure service container. The answer to that is not yet. Right now, we're focused on primary Linux on Z. Now, we might be able to negotiate about HPVS and running Linux workloads there, because really all you're going to need is a Linux on Z guest of some type that meets certain package requirements, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But this isn't available yet as a what we'll call a native secure service container or ZACI style product. So how do you get it? Step one, go out and order it. Step two, enable support inside your ESM. Step three, enable support per user. This isn't a one huge global setting. We'll talk about the flexibility of this. And then step four, log onto your ZVM system with a slightly different workflow. Question in the chat, does the product include a Linux distribution? It does not. We do have required Linux distribution levels, which we'll talk about in just a second. But this is, I think, an RPM or distro equivalent type of package, and there will be one or two things that you want to make sure are running inside the guest that you provide. But this is a guest that you provide, not one that we give you. It's not an appliance. It's a bring your own Linux. Yes, precisely. As Romney says, BYOL, bring your own Linux style of application. So, step one, get IBM Z MFA version 2.1. This can be ordered today. It's product 5565-MA1. Yes, it's a catchy title. If you already have the ZOS MFA solution, this is the same product. So if you're upgrading, you should be given the option to download either the ZOS version or the ZVM version, or both. You cannot use the ZOS version for ZVM authentication or vice versa. If anybody cares, I'll get into that later on. But suffice to say that ZOS security is ZOS security, and ZVM security is ZVM security, and we didn't want to try to mix and match here. So if you have both ZOS and ZVM, and you want to run MFA on each, you do need both servers. Then you'll install this package into a Linux on Z guest. This could be SLES 15 or later, or RHEL 8 or later. I do get the question every now and again about, well, maybe we have SLES 12 SP3. Is that okay? No, it's not. I hear you, but this is a hard requirement for these distro levels, as well as specific packages that you'll want in your BYOL guest. So this is not a support statement that maybe you can kind of hedge around, but an actual limit. If this is a concern, though, we definitely want to hear about it. Question in the chat: Ubuntu. There's currently no support for Ubuntu. If this is something that is of interest, we would be more than open to requirements on it. Additional comment in the chat: any concerns if you're sharing the RACF database between ZVM and ZOS? Let me offer the technical response to that. You could do it, but frankly, we're discouraging the sharing of RACF databases in between ZVM and ZOS in the first place. And I believe in the future that is in fact going to be something that IBM actively tries to prevent you from doing. Yeah, okay, the SOD did come out yesterday. Thank you, Jim. 7.2 will technically allow it, but sometime in the future we will technically prevent you from doing that. So we would encourage you not to pursue that avenue. While the RACF databases will tolerate that type of a configuration today, and you could try to run MFA in that context, you're kind of compounding the reason that we introduced this SOD in the first place, which is that we want to avoid things like user namespace collision and policy collision between ZOS and ZVM. Since your ZVM and ZOS systems may have different security requirements, and we don't want the ZOS people certainly messing up ZVM by making any kind of changes in the RACF database or vice versa. not saying it wouldn't work, but I would highly discourage you from pursuing that avenue, especially in light of the SOD. Also worth noting that if you're using a type of factor that requires another server, such as RSA Secure ID, there may be more software you need to go out and acquire, or alternately software or service code that you already have access to because you already set it up for ZOS. So that actually can be reused. Check your documentation for the details. Where do you want to put the Linux guest? Well, I owe Bill a beer now because I'm going to go ahead and say it. It depends. And it really depends upon how comfortable you are with where you want to put the MFA server relative to your ESM. We encourage you to install MFA servers with the idea that you have one MFA server per ESM database. That's not precisely a hard and fast rule, but it's definitely a good rule of thumb. So you could do it on a single standalone system, sure, and you'll see here that MFA is talking via TCP/IP to RACF VM. Important note, something we'll talk about a little bit later. You could install it on multiple systems. Certainly, if you have a single system image, or if you have 1 to N ZVM systems that happen to be sharing a RACF database, then you could have an MFA server running on one LPAR, the MFA backup server running in another LPAR. They could be on completely separate KECs, certainly from a DR and high availability perspective. We want to make sure that you can always log on to your ZVM system no matter which KEC happens to be up and down, right? I'm not aware that there's any problem with relocating the Linux guest that your MFA server happens to be running in, but why take that chance? You might as well spread out the joy here in terms of having MFA available in multiple different places. And of course, while we're not making any comments about secure service containers, you can certainly run this as Linux on zguest in its own LPAR if you were so inclined. All the ESM needs is TCP/IP connectivity to the MFA server and MFA backup servers that you happen to specify, right? So as long as it can reach it, it doesn't really matter just where in the enterprise it happens to run, so long as it's in a Linux on zguest that happens to meet a particular spec. So to summarize, MFA product, if you have the ZOS version, you may have it already. Go ahead and download the Linux-based server, install it on your systems. This MFA server can be used and will be used via web UI in order to set up policies for administering users, factors, and all sorts of credentials for human users trying to log onto your ZVM system. This version will support the out-of-band authentication factors. You will present all your credentials to a web browser interface. You'll get the derived credential, which I admit I did. It wasn't my choice to abbreviate the derived credential as CTC. I understand that may have 1 or 2 other meetings in the ZVM space. So I'm going to say derived credential, which will be valid for N minutes and hours and may have a certain number of reuse options available for it. That credential is what you're going to put in on the ZVM logon screen. It's important to note, though, that policies are really meant for human users. And for the longest time, we've had both human and technical users in the ZVM space. And certainly the more traditional model of running ZVM, where every CMS guest happened to represent a distinct and actual and real human being, you're going to need a lot of MFA definitions for those kinds of systems. For systems that are perhaps more Linux-based, more Linux host-oriented, things that may be leaning into cloud-based applications or heading in the direction of OpenShift, where you have 1 or 2 sysprogs that are demonstrably human, and then a bunch of technical users that really just represent automated workloads. you really only have to give MFA authority and MFA credentials to the humans, because they're the ones that would get in trouble if something went wrong on the system, right? You can't actually press legal charges against TCP maint. So once you got the product, make sure that ZVM is up to date. Do up level to RSU 7104 or have the PTF that's on the screen on your ZVM system. Now, if you're running in an SSI, we highly encourage you to have all of this service in place before you get started. It's not to say that you could not technically run this in a mixed level SSI with 6.4 and 7.1, but because there is no MFA support on 6.4, your ESM is not going to go check with the NFA server as to whether or not a derived credential that you give it is valid or not. And so it's going to fail that derived credential as a failed password attempt. And if you enter the derived credential wrong or your password wrong, that will increase the expiry count and lead to you getting locked out of the ZVM system. So this is really, since an SSI especially is meant to be a single security context, do try to get as close to common here as possible, just because we don't want you to encounter any particular hangups, problems, hitches with anything that's going on. There is service for RACF and there is service for Broadcom. We talked about Broadcom a little bit yesterday, just in case anybody missed that. I really just wanted to take this slide to say that because VM Secure does play a non-trivial role in the ZVM ecosystem, we wanted to make sure, frankly, that they interoperated with the new MFA server, and we didn't accidentally lock them out or cause them any problems when going through this design and deployment process. So VM Secure is all set, ready to go. Support came out, I believe, at the same time as RACF and the actual product. And again, check out their demo video from yesterday to check out what that looks like, which I encourage because from a logon perspective, it's not really going to matter which ESM you have. It only really matters from a sysprog and security management question. Question in the chat, is ACF2 for ZVM supported? Not today. And I would encourage you to chat with the Broadcom folks about that if that's a requirement for you. So the RACF changes are similar to the changes that were made for VM Secure, as talked about yesterday. So when you're adding, altering users, you will see MFA commands, password fallback options, which you can add or remove as you would like. MFA support will appear on list user, on seterops list for global settings. I believe there's actually now a seterops list MFA to give you the details of what's going on your system. And again, you don't necessarily have to make every single machine on your system MFA enabled. Similarly, you don't have to make them all password fallback equals yes either. Password fallback is what happens when if the MFA server, and we hope it doesn't do this, crashes, perhaps because an intern forced off the wrong guest, and then suddenly you can't authenticate to your system, password fallback allows you to use that ESM password I asked you not to delete yet. So it's there in case of emergencies, in much the same way that the failsoft processing is available should your entire ESM go away, right? So good to have for emergencies, although we do want to get away from using that particular model. Also worth noting that in the case of RACF, we actually send a message to the system operator for out-of-policy usage. So should Mr. Bittner or Mr. Munson happen to use password fallback, the operator is going to get notified. It's not that they're not allowed to do that. Indeed, we've rather explicitly granted them access to do that because we trust them in an emergency to get things going again. That said, if Bill was just using password fallback because he couldn't remember his IBM internal website password anymore and just wanted to use his 8-character password, well, that might lead to people having chats with him, and I don't encourage that kind of thing, and I hate getting people in trouble. But on the other hand, I hate getting audited also. So this stuff appears on the operator console rather specifically because we want to make sure that no one gets in trouble, and we can prove that everything happened the way that it was supposed to. And again, while authentication itself gets decided by the MFA server, RACF and VM Secure are still the policy enforcement point. You know, they're the ones that will tell you yay or nay. They're the ones that are going to double check policy. They're the ones that are going to let you know that password fallback is not enabled. They're the ones that are going to go double check and let you know if the drive credential is even valid anymore, because frankly, it may not be. Question in the chat, the password is needed. Not necessarily. If you have what we call password fallback, which is okay, it's a joke. Yes, sorry about that. It's hard to read humor via WebEx chat. I'll make a note about improving my sense of humor for the next time I give this presentation. So, a couple more things to note about configuring your ESM. Your ESM is going to need TCP/IP in order to communicate to the MFA server. That means you are probably going to need, if you have not already, configure the TLS server to connect securely in between RACF and MFA. While yes, the derived credential is not terribly sensitive from a security perspective, I know security people get really, really twitchy at the idea that something may or may not be encrypted. Mea culpa. So we encourage you to do that, and I know that Mr. Munson has a presentation later on today about the joys of SSL, and I do highly encourage you to check that out, because that presentation may inadvertently end up relating to this presentation. Additionally, you're going to configure the IP address for your not only your MFA server, but for your backup. And RACF will try to rotate in between those two servers, just in case one happens to go away. MFA, again, is enabled on a per-user basis. Password fallback is not automatic. That's enabled on a per-user basis. And again, MFA, humans. The Linux guests shouldn't have or need hypervisor level passwords for the most part. Service machines should be auto-only or log-on by only anyway. Certainly in 7.1, we started changing the default user directory to push in that direction anyway. So, but we did that because we assumed most of you had already made those changes. So take this as an opportunity to think about just what it is that you're trying to secure here in terms of your defaults. So in addition to the ZVM user IDs, which I will point out will work for surrogate and logon by users, this server does also protect the HMC. The HMC was enabled to use the ZOS version of IBM Z MFA exclusively for RSA Secure ID. And we certainly didn't want any of the Linux One folks out there to have to go out and buy an IBM Z box, install ZOS, and install ZOS MFA just to be able to secure their HMC, right? So you can use the Linux on Z version to lock down your HMC in terms of MFA. I am inevitably going to get the question, what about the Linux guests? That's planned for. Certainly, we already made the updates to PAM, the pluggable authentication module, so that Linux on Z guests could talk to the ZOS version of MFA. And we do expect that we're going to make those updates for the ZVM version as well. We really hope this will be a general repository for Linux One in terms of securing the identity and authentication flow for the platform. So I expect this server to see a lot of growth in the future, which means that as I'm talking, start jotting down requirements. I'll be happy to hear them. Question in the chat, is there a red book or hints for implementing that, Pam? I believe there is a red paper by Manfred Nurse that came out a couple of years ago for the ZOS version exclusively. Once the ZVM version is ready, I have no doubt that an additional red paper will be put together to that end. I don't have that red paper linked at the end of this deck, but I have a feeling that by the time I upload this to the VM Workshop page, that link will be there. So in terms of setting policies, I'm not going to walk through many charts about this here, but there's going to be a web UI that you can use to define your ZVM user IDs. Now that sounds kind of painful, but it's not, because there's going to be tooling to help you identify and migrate ZVM user IDs for inclusion in the MFA server. We don't want you to have to do all this by hand. Your users may have multiple policies that are associated with them. I'll explain why in just a minute. And you can determine just when certain factors are allowed to be used. So we've had a lot of text. Let me see if I can try to break this down into pictures. In the before times, how authentication worked, I mean, it just looked like you were logging on via PCOM, right? What was happening under the covers is that your TN3270 client would connect to ZVM via a TLS protected channel, go through the TCP/IP virtual machine, get decrypted by the SSL server, and then you would get your ZVM logon prompt. You would present a user ID and a passphrase, which would get validated by RACF or your ESM of choice. And then if valid, it would then allow you to connect to your virtual machine. What happens now is, first, what you're going to do is you're going to take your web browser of choice, or maybe a mobile app, and point it at IBM Z MFA, a Linux guest running somewhere in your data center. It's going to give you the derived credential. That's what you provide instead of your password via this channel now, because now when that channel gets established to your CP logon screen, you'll enter that data. RACF or your ESM is going to validate that credential is still valid by double checking with the MFA guest itself, and then and only then allow you to log on. It's going to look a little bit different, but it's not that very many more steps. And in fact, it's going to look like this, or something similar to this. You'll see a URL at the top of your web browser screen here, and that represents your particular logon policy. Your security people are going to give you this link. Bookmark it. Don't lose this link, because speaking as a security person, they're probably going to make fun of you if you lose it. I mean, they'll send you another one, but security people gonna security people. So once you point your browser window at this particular window, you provide your ZVM user ID and all of your authentication tokens on one screen. Again, we're not doing multi-step authentication, it's multi-factor. You provide all the factors at once. If you get one wrong, we're just going to give you a generic error that said you messed something up. But if it succeeds, we're going to give you this derived credential. Now, this value is editable in terms of what gets passed back in terms of character set and length. I think there's a couple options for alphanumeric. Did you want special characters? Did you want it to be 8 or 16 characters? From a security perspective, and certainly from a compliance perspective, it doesn't really matter that much, but your internal security people may have feels about just what this credential looks like. So we have some options here, and if you need more options, we're open to requirements. And once you provide that, you'll take that token, put it on your logon flow as appropriate, and then you will get to log on to your ZVM system. Question in the chat about CAC. In our case, what happens is we did not make too many modifications to the logon flow itself. That would be one of those in-band authentication types of things. What we ask you to do is, again, to provide your CAC card and credentials via the web browser, get the token, and then just provide that token on the ZVM logon screen. In-band authentication of any sort will take a fair amount more time to provide. So if that is something that is of interest to you, you will want to let me know. Send me emails. My email will be at the end of this presentation. Get in touch with me somehow, and definitely open up requirements such that we can start getting that rolling. But in the meantime, you're just making one more stop in terms of MFA via the browser before you get to log on to ZVM. Again, multi-factor and not multi-step. We want to make sure that this derived credential meets spec for your security people. You can configure how many times you can use this credential. It could be a one-time use thing if you're so inclined, or you can have it valid for a certain number of seconds, minutes, perhaps up to 24 hours even. And I'll explain why in just a sec. And again, you can configure the length of it if your security people care about that sort of thing. So you can have more than one policy per human user. You may have different security rules if you are at your physical office, or if compared to if for whatever reason you happen to be working at home a whole lot lately. So depending upon what your security people want to do, you could go to a different URL based upon from whence you're logging on. Your ESM will make that determination about surrogate or logon by authority. Again, MATE 710, GSK admin operators should not have their own passwords. Similarly, they should not have their own MFA tokens. We save that for the humans. And again, you may have different policies for different types of human users. Certainly, in terms of who knows things and who has access to what, the things that I can do to a ZVM system may be rather distinct from the things that Romney or Munson or Mr. Bintner could accomplish in terms of the amount of sheer damage we could do if we logged on the wrong day. So your policies may shift based upon that, or perhaps based upon the type of system you're trying to log on to. So let me try to illustrate this. Let's say we have a company that configures its ZVM instances with an ESM and the MFA server for use inside of an SSI. It has YubiKeys elsewhere in the enterprise, so it wanted to use that. It has Active Directory for general enterprise identity management, and we've set up two MFA policies, one with a digital certificate and a YubiKey, and one with a digital cert and LDAP bind into Active Directory. We've decided for our case that tokens will last for 12 hours, and they are replayable for as long as you want within that 12-hour window. Human user Brian, hi, logs on to ZVM precisely at 8 a.m. He has had his coffee. He is ready to go. He gets his derived credential. He can log on and authenticate whenever he wants. Now, the timer starts at 8 a.m. I may not log on to MATE 710 until 9 a.m., or GSK admin until 9:30, or TCP maint until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But I can still use that same derived credential throughout that entire time period, which is nice. It means that I don't have to keep going to that web browser and getting a new token every time I want to log on and realize I forgot something. Precisely how I got into the office these days is open to debate, but we'll say that a miracle happened. Maybe I went into the office to go get my security hammer and decided to log on as long as I was there. When I get back home at 9 p.m., I realized that I need to issue one more command. YubiKey's at the office, though, so at 9 p.m., I'll have to re-authenticate because my other token has expired. I will get a new token based upon my digital cert and my Active Directory password, and that will be valid until 9 a.m. the next morning. So we've done a fair amount of chatting with folks to make sure that all your preferred tokens are there. And we had that chart toward the front of the deck that leaned into all the different flavors that we have. There are a lot of different flavors of Radius and YubiKey and Duo and whatnot. We've tried to make the support inside IBM Z MFA as generic as possible, such that we want things to be able to interoperate. So if you're finding that you can't find out whether or not it's supported, ask. If you find something missing, let us know, because we will definitely add that to the next version that we release. Again, because we are trying to keep ZOS and ZVM distinct, we don't necessarily encourage you to share, and we would want you to share MFA servers in between those two platforms. And frankly, the communication security styles are different. MFA on ZOS is really tightly coupled to RACF, and RACF remains the policy decision point on that platform. We took a very different tactic on ZVM because we wanted to move things in a much different direction. So even if you could point them to each other, they wouldn't really know how to speak to one another. So follow the guidelines as presented. Do make sure that your Linux guest is up to date. If there's a problem with the Linux distros that we currently have provided, let us know. We'll look at loosening some of those restrictions. And I have been talking an awful lot, and I realize I've probably gone just a smidge over time. I've tried to answer questions as they come in, but have I missed anything?
If there's questions out there, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or type them in the chat.
Question: if I have 8 systems that need tokens, can I cut the credential and paste all day long, or is the next system going to wipe out the previous one? Depends upon how your MFA server policy is configured. If you allow for replay and that MFA server happens to serve all 8 of those systems, then you can use that one all day long. If your MFA policy is such that it does not allow for replay, then you'll have to re-authenticate every single time that you log on. It really depends upon the type of user and the type of information that it's accessing. For sysprog use, especially in the ZVM space, I really hope that folks go into extended replay, for a certain predefined number of hours, and use the surrogate and log on by, such that they can log on to all the virtual machines they need during their workday without having to keep hitting the pellet bar. Does that make sense? Well, whether it does or not, I'm out of time. I will be online to answer other questions, or you can always reach out once you're done looking at all the information. If you think of any further requirements for us, do let us know. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen and/or putting yourself on mute while you took a nap. Back to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Brian. As he said, if you have other questions and comments, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm sure he'll be around for a little bit more of the event.